to have with us this evening to open the General Assembly with some remarks Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, who is, as we heard yesterday, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. In his previous career as a politician, he rose to the ranks of Minister of Foreign Affairs in his home country of the Maldives, and has been called the lead reformer of Maldivian politics. However, he was fighting a battle against rising Islamism and authoritarianism, which eventually forced him into resignation from his ministerial role and into the self-imposed exile in which he now lives. But the Maldives' loss is international human rights gain, because he was well known as an excellent special rapporteur on human rights in Iran, and his early work in his mandate on freedom of religion or belief has been just as promising. We're very pleased to have built a good relationship with him already. Indicative of that, I think, is his visit here to us today. He's going to have some remarks for us, and then I think we'll have some time for a few questions that people may want to ask. Now, would you want to sit or stand? Sit. Okay. Dr. Ahmed Shaheed.
Thank you. Very kind welcome. It's an honor to be here to speak at the start of the IHEU Assembly this year. I was asked to speak a bit about myself and about my work. I think I'll leave a bit about myself. We've heard enough of that already. But let me briefly speak about my work. The mandate I hold for the UN, the mandate on freedom of religion or belief, is tied to the monitoring of the 1981 UN Declaration on Religion. That's the farthest UN could go with formulating a normative framework for this right. There is a treaty pending for the past 50 years now, and it's unlikely to make any advances on that also. But one consequence of that is the normative confusion that surrounds the mandate. A lot of it is willful misconceptions by states and others who wish to distort what the right means. And some of it may be genuine also, because religion and human rights have an uncomfortable fate. The only time perhaps religion broadly understood has a good fate is in humanists' conception, because it is within the human rights framework. But for religions, they have a competing normative framework that can overlap, intersect, contradict, or even be at times in harmony with the human rights framework. So this is the primary concern that I'm faced with, and one I try to address quite methodically. Of course, such misconceptions, willful or otherwise, can result in many issues. It's often to do with equating religion with the human right. In other words, religious freedom as a human right is confused with demands made by religion. So people will argue, my religion dictates that I do this, including coercive practices. So therefore, religion is invoked as a justification for actions that actually violate other people's human rights. Coercive and harmful practices are quite commonly seen to be rooted in religious teachings. There are many cases in which a majority religion would be privileged over others. Iran has different grades of religions in the country. It's not very uncommon. There are many who privilege one religion or the others. And this can result in things in various discrimination, including through the use of identity cards, which can be used as a way to give privilege or deny access to privileges. Sometimes countries use religion as a justification to shield criticism of religion by various people. So the idea that religious freedom can be used to suppress freedom of expression is quite antithetical to the human rights framework. But the entire arguments from OIC Islamic countries that with strong blasphemy laws that you cannot criticize religion or religious leaders is just based on that misconception. And then of course, in some countries, there are strong laws against conversion. Again, using the argument that religions need to be protected, not human beings who are the rights holders of this faith. So one of the key challenges I face is try to clarify the normative framework for everybody so we can actually have an engagement on that basis. So what are my priorities? Yesterday I saw Elizabeth highlight the IHEU's priorities. I align myself with all of these things she mentioned. First of all, for FOB itself, non-clarification is a priority for me, like I said. harmful traditional practices. Again, there's a lot of religion involved in that. LGBTI rights often are violated in the name of religion. Ritual sacrifice and witchcraft violations are increasing in some parts of the world. Sexual and reproductive health rights, again, in developed countries we see religion invoked as a reason to push back on those rights. And then caste discrimination and modern slavery practices. Again, a lot of it linked to certain religious practices. And from the theme, from a conference yesterday, I drew up again two further themes. What I call increased politicization of religion, political use of religion for populist purposes. And then also securitization of religion, using security as an argument to either claim privilege or undermine people's practice of their beliefs. So these are my core areas which I think have a very close fit with IHEU's priorities as well. So I'm happy to see that sort of commonality there. My work requires me to submit 2 thematic reports to the UN per year, one in March to the Council of Geneva and then one in October to the session of the Assembly in New York. And then 2 country reports based on country missions, so 4 reports a year. My thematic reports cover those issues I just mentioned about non-clarification and other phenomena that require addressing. Beyond that, I carry out an advocacy function. I send communications to governments of 2 types: allegation letters, where there has been a violation reported, or urgent appeal, where there is the threat of an imminent violation, and then something called very inelegantly other letters. I don't know why the UN chose that jargon, but other usually cover things like raising concerns about legislation making its way through the processes, which could end up in violating people's rights, or some government policy that's been announced, which could, like the visa ban was announced in January, could impinge on people's right to freedom of religion or belief. And then I issue press statements. Governments hate press statements, and so there was a huge, if you like, procedure to be followed in doing that. There's a code of conduct imposed on people like me by the UN because they can't control me. Countries declare a code of conduct, which tries to stifle our work to the maximum possible way we can do it. They can do it. But we can be creative in bypassing or using that as a way to actually become more effective. So I think that code has enabled us to be more robust in how we criticize countries, because we can say, look, we followed your code, and still we are able to point fingers at you for what you've been wrong here. The practice increasingly is for us to operate as a community, as a team. So I would very rarely issue a press statement or a communication only in my own name. I still prefer to in some cases because I can then go into the depths of my arguments with more space. But typically we find that joint communications by a number of rapporteurs have a strong impact on countries who receive them. Now, in the limited time I have, I just want to make a couple of points here. One is, yes, there is, I think, thanks to the reports that you publish, growing awareness of the plight of humanists around the world. So you find the UN's reporting increasing focus on humanists. I also want to stress that in my observations, that humanists, when they attacked far more viciously and brutally than I think in other cases. It's partly because there is this, the conception that humanists require no protection. So in Bangladesh, what we hear are people hacked to death brutally on the streets or cafes everywhere. Ahmed Shaheed in the Maldives, he was stabbed 36 times. For what? He was simply a free thinker who expressed his ideas, who made jokes about the mullahs and so on and so forth. And of course, at the end of that, the president went and said, we cannot tolerate blasphemy. So you can see the framework, how that actually empowers people to attack people they see as beyond, not deserving of protection. So this is one dimension that I'm very concerned about, the brutality with which social hostilities are visited upon humanists the world over. You would not find this kind of viciousness in attacks on other communities. Of course, the Baha'i and the Ahmadis face very serious violations, but I think if you look at specific cases, the brutality with which humanists and atheists are attacked exceeds other forms of viciousness that I have come across. Now I want to stop by referring to 3 documents that we should draw to your attention, because I would like to see your engagement on these 3 documents. One is, like I said yesterday, the Rabat Plan of Action. The good thing about this is it focuses on asking states not to criminalize blasphemy, This is vital for the protection of humanists, because often blasphemy laws are invoked to criticize and condemn those who criticize established religions. Same with apostasy laws as well. And then maybe when it was framed 5 years ago, the humanists weren't sort of so deeply invited to the process. But I intend to make sure that in the 5-year review coming up this year, that I'll spend all my efforts to make sure that we have a voice at the table. That will be vitally important. It speaks of roles of religious leaders, among other things, such as not to incite violence against others. That's something very important, because most frequently the targets are humanists. To counter hate speech with better speech. Again, if someone's attacking you for your beliefs, well, stand up and say you can't do that. Everyone has space to do that. And also, never to incite violence, even as a reaction to religious hurt. So these are very important 3 elements that are prescribed in this, among other things. The other document is something called the FEZ process. I'm not sure in the end if I succeeded in getting Andrew a seat at the table there, but again, it's indicative of the difficulty we have as a process, to include humanists in the discussions. What it does is, it identifies an action plan detailed for states, NGOs and others to respond to incitement to violence that can lead to mass atrocity. So it is in the context of the ISIL and so on, it was developed. But again, we see in South Asia, this happens, so there's a need to engage with that, in implementing that. And thirdly, the Beirut Declaration and the 18 commitments on faith for rights. I was happy to see Elizabeth there at Beirut, arguing for a real strong language that would include everybody in that. Again, what it does do is, it tries to draw links between different faiths, very broadly understood, including humanism, faiths and human rights. Because often some faith traditions say we have a monopoly on the truth, and therefore we are legitimate, human rights have no space in this. I think Islam is very good at arguing this, but there are others also who do similar things as well. So what we try to do here is understand that there's an emotional bond between faith and people. That if you can mobilize that emotional bond, probably have a stronger support for human rights when you frame it in a way that you can link human rights with the actual beliefs. So this is again designed to give a stronger, I think, appeal and stronger emotional foundation for human rights to stand on. Now, I would really encourage you to look at these 3 documents and see how you could engage with these processes. And also, as my last call here, encourage what I call transboundary engagement. To talk to those who have different views, to talk to those who disagree with you perhaps, but build those bonds of solidarity and inclusion. Because coming back to yesterday's theme, populism thrives on tribalism, and the antidote to that would be inclusion and more solidarity. So I shall end my remarks at that. And again, thank you for this honor and privilege to come and speak to you this morning. I'll be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you again.
Dr. Shaheed, thank you very much. We certainly can, I think, promise our full support to you as you proceed in your mandate, and we will work together very happily. Questions? Any questions?
We have a mic.
It's up there.
We do have a mic.
Oh, this is detachable, is it?
No,
you have to go up there.
So
you didn't ask if we had a detachable mic.
No, don't worry. You get your minute in the spotlight.
Yes. Yes, Boris.
Shall I do it like this?
Yes.
I think it's
Well, of course, we are focusing as IHEU and International Humanists, especially on free thinkers, atheists, and those kind of persons who are really articulate their fact that they are thinking different than a religious view. But the number of people who would say that they are non-affiliated, maybe they're religious, but they're not affiliated to a church or to a mosque or organized religion, is much bigger than our group. And I think they have the freedom of religion and belief too. And of course they're not so as articulated as we are maybe. So, but it's hard to find in studies how big that group exactly is. It's a guess in general. The Gallup Research Institute is doing that, Pew Research Institute is doing that, but it's a kind of a guess. And what can you do to have more information about the way people are religiously affiliated. Because now, it's normally, if you say you're a Muslim, that's the answer to the question, or a Christian, but it's not specified in what you believe and what kind of things you believe in the institutional religion, or what dogmas you don't follow. It's interesting to see in some countries like the Philippines, where we had a meeting a few years ago, the 95% is Roman Catholic, but on, for example, some healthcare issues, medical, ethical issues, they don't follow the Roman Catholic Church, a majority of that country. So I want to ask you if you as a special rapporteur can also say something or advise something to the UN to have a more specified view on what people actually believe instead of just ticking the box Muslim, Christian, atheist or whatever. Because that gives, I think, a lot of more insight how the world is actually, well, indexed.
Yes, we'll take it one at a time.
Okay, well, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. In fact, one thing I'm stressing in my upcoming report is the need to have more data. And there's the UN some ways of advancing that. But one difficulty with what you suggested would be the fact that we have to protect people's views. They have to voluntarily declare their views. The idea that you list what you believe in would be perhaps the wrong path to go, because it can open itself to be abused by states that violate rights. But then doesn't mean we should be able to collect that information. So we should be able to devise some methodology, and I haven't got a clue yet at the moment, but I'm hoping to engage with experts who do collect data. And there are governments like in the UK, for example, who are also very keen on getting the data, properly developed, so we can respond appropriately. So we know how big the problem is, we know what the population looks like, so we can respond accordingly. So beyond saying that I would talk to experts on this and look at ways to sort of get more actual empirical data, I don't have a solution to that, because it is important to protect the right to believe in private whatever, unless one wants to make public what wants to believe. Because we see the alternative, the ID cards that are used and abused for a variety of purposes. But thank you for the question. I will take it up.
I just want to ask one, like in the report which you plan to present, are you putting like caste discrimination and the violence against the Dalits in South Asia? That is one issue. The other will be the violence against minorities in the name of their food eating habits, like the cow and the beef issue in India. And the third is that, is there any suggestion from your part for the government that many people who are not religious, but in our part of the world, we don't have a choice to say we are atheist or humanist or non-believer. So I think this should also be promoted by your report, that the clause of being humanist should be there in our constitution. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I should say, my report has an absolute guillotine word count. 10,400, oh, I'm done. The UN won't receive it. So there's a limit on how I can put in a report. Also, I have to bear in mind the audience for the report. It's a dialogue with states, hoping to get them to engage with me. And in New York, where my next report is, it's a far more hostile setting than Geneva. In Geneva, they understand human rights. In New York, they don't talk about human rights. So it's a much more difficult exercise. So I'm still debating with me the balance between calling out countries and getting them to work with me. I do have a list. I don't recall right now that we have casteism and cow lynching in it, but I'm very close to putting cow lynching and casteism in it. Now, I will do a report in the future on state engagement with religion. And this would mean specifically focusing on countries like India, where you get, like Andrew said, what will happen without much clarity on what's going on. When I said I support the prioritization of modern slavery practices, well, casteism to some extent falls into the category, as does many Muslim state practices like early marriage and so on. So there's a whole range I want to look at. I'm also mindful not to, unless I was doing a country report, not to pick on one particular state, because then it distorts the debate in the council. If I am seen to be really looking a broad look and calling out on a wide variety of phenomena, then I get a better engagement by states. But that's the debate. Beyond the debate, I can convene any number of side events, any number of conferences and so on, which can focus on a specific country or issue like you mentioned.
Right, we will take the 3 questions that have already been indicated here at the front. I don't think, okay, 4, and then we will move on with the rest of our business, of course, which, as I say, is very heavy. So exercise brevity, please. Yes. Please
yes.
say your name and where you're from, by the way. Yeah.
Eva Quiñones from Puerto Rico. Expanding on what Boris was talking about, the data, it's very hard, as you said, to out people by having them fill a mark on a paper that says, this is my religion. But I think a way to go around that is to more emphasize the gathering of information of religious commitment. How many times a week or a month or a year you go to a religious service. And probably you can evaluate the religious commitment, because actually what you believe in your head, there's no machine to read that, but your outward manifestation of religiosity is the one that counts for the effects of having some data. So that would be maybe a suggestion, trying to get some data on religious commitment on some specific factors that would be less damaging to a person.
I think, just to be clear, Dr. Shaheed, I think both of our colleagues here, they're not talking about government-collected data, state-controlled data, they're talking about social research.
Yeah.
That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you for that input. Yes, there are ways to use proxies to understand that. In fact, big data may offer an opportunity to sort of analyze more deeply, but I am again concerned to embark on a path that could open the way to breach the forum internal. I understand what you mean is, people like IHEU, others collecting data for purpose of your own advocacy and so on. We should know what's going on. And we should find a way to know that also, but while respecting the forum internal. What I fear about big data is that by analyzing what one eats, how one sleeps, and buys this and that, states can make conclusions about what your faith may be. If you avoid certain sort of types of cloth, maybe they'll say, well, you are this type. If you end up in certain place maybe 5 times a day, they might say you are this or that. Or if you avoid certain food or eat certain, you get to a situation where states can use that type of information methodology for that as well. But I fully accept the fact that we as a community of people trying to promote freedom of religion or belief also need to know who we are talking about. So it's a fine balance to be had, I think, in that.
Mr. Shaheed, I am talking about that we want more definition about the relation between the faith, religion, and humanism, because religious extremism is a big challenge to our humanism, and humanism is not a problem for any reason. We have to discuss on this point that what relationship we should have with the religion and with the humanism. If we are humanist, then we are not creating problems. The problems are created by the religious fundamentalists there. So we should have the clarity on this one.
That goes to, I think, what you were saying earlier about links between humanists and religious groups across boundaries.
Right. Yeah. Well, religions, as we commonly understand, are theistic. Of course, we also include non-theistic as well. But traditionally, religions are theistic and have a supreme being attached to it in some form or other. That's a traditional under religion. And in that framework, many religions preach obedience to the supreme being at the expense of everybody else, right? Now, what I'm saying is the human rights framework and humanism puts the human being at the center. The human being's needs take priority over anything else. Now, that's the argument I'm advancing, that I'm not asking religions to sort of interrogate their beliefs. What I'm saying is put the human beings at the center. To my Muslim colleagues, I tell them, needs of God should take priority over needs of man, generically, man and women. Because as some Islamic scholars say, the needs of the human being have to be fulfilled here and now. Rights of God can be dealt with later on. Now, there are some scholars who actually believe this, who argue this. One example would be Khalid Abu al-Fadil, a professor at UCLA, who makes this point, saying this is the only way Muslims can approach human rights. So if you cannot place human beings at the center of what you do, but put something else in center, then you are a different normative dimension. So that is the way that you can reconcile this.
I'm going to take the last 3 questions all at once, one after the other, and then Dr. Shaheed. Yeah, only the ones that have been already indicated. Your hand wasn't up earlier. Okay, if you can be very short, Narendra, I'll come to you in a moment. Julia. Yes.
No, just to mention in response to what Boris said, there is a study on the secularization of the Italian society that's being done now for 20 years about, and it is only based on data that are the object of official statistic registration, both by the Italian Statistical Service and by the Vatican one, and by the sellers of pharmaceutics. That is based on 300 different data sources from the statistics about how many priests there are, how many relinquish priesthood, how many people attend religious schools, and so on, so on, so on, how many condoms are sold, how many contraceptives, and that has been summarized by a statistician of Rome University in a general index that has been growing steadily since, but it requires a lot of effort, and we are only able to do this thanks to the support of the main Italian trade union. So as a European federation, or I'm the president of the European Humanist Federation, by the way, we have decided that we have to do something simpler, that is index of the secularity of the states. Anyway, if anybody were interested, I can introduce you to the procedural things about this essay, which is very interesting because there is a connection between the progress of secularity and justice and the resources given to the church that are going on.
Thank you very much. That is very interesting. We will circulate that data to send it to us. Yes, brief. Everyone's
yeah, just
brief.
one question.
You say.
Is the UN report going to take care of some advantages given to religions by this state? By tax exemptions, they can run industries without tax, they can run schools without tax. Are you going to take it up? Because it's conferring an unfair advantage for religions over the others.
Thank you very much, Bambu, and then Ivan, and then we're done. Yeah.
Sir, one of your distinguished predecessors, Professor Abdel Fattah Amor, said eloquently that I do not bring religion to human rights, I take humanism to religion and human rights to religion. I did alert one of your other predecessors, Asma Jahangir, that there is this popular word, Islamophobia. Why is the UN Special Rapporteur allowed to show secular phobia in their reports? Because the UN Human Rights Council has been submitted reports which were attacking secularism. And it's not just Malaysia, it's not just Saudi Arabia, but the language, the text of certain Special Rapporteur's reports were attacking seculars, attacking us, humanists. We'd request your protection from such abuse.
Thank you very much. Anyone?
Dr. Shaheed, my name is Ivan, I work for the Belgian Flemish Humanist. We can observe that in every religious community you have a rather broad discrepancy between the cultural religious people and the persons who are very radical, very extreme right in their way of expressing and feeling their belief. Now, I often see that interfaith dialogue is portrayed as one of the main solutions in peace building and conflict resolution in regard with UN techniques. We observe that in interfaith dialogue, it's often the wrong person who come around the table. You have the very open-minded and tolerant priest, imam, rabbi, who is willing to build together and to work together. But there is a problem for those religious leaders to reach out to the more far-right, to the more radicalized communities within their religious group. My question is, do you see a solution, and would you think it useful for you to write this in your report, that every religious leader in interfaith dialogue have the responsibility to reach out to the less open-minded elements in their community?
Thank you very much. Right, over to you.
Thank you. Last question first. The phase process, it took 2 years and it had many meetings. Prioritized doing that, being able to speak to those who are not convinced of what they have been said to them. So that is an essential part of this. And interfaith dialogue is only one part of what you should talk about. Equally important is that of education, starting from school curriculum of the very young child and so on, as well as media. who has access to media? Is it diverse enough to carry all opinions and so on? Of course, legal framework matters, but education and media access are also important. On secularism, what the UN has been saying, essentially there are two types of secularism. One becomes an ideology in itself, is promoted at the expense of rights, and we find many states who go to the secular actually go and suppress people's rights, trying to empty the public space of any manifestation of faith. That's also not on, right? But you're right, where a state takes a secular detachment from religion, then that's the best environment for promoting human rights. And like any other faith, broadly understood community, the UN should, I would, seek to protect the rights of secular believers as well. Humanists, sorry, as well, thank you.
And the separation of religions and the state?
Oh yes. My current report does not go specifically into that. And you're right, there hasn't been a UN report that examines that in detail. But there is one subject I am very keen on, looking at how state uses various bureaucratic methods to privilege one set of doctrines. So from sermon policy and sermon writing to funding schools and funding various other activities, that the state involvement in religion is a concern, and I hope to make it a subject of a future report.
Dr. Shaheed, you have our deepest respect for all the work that you've done, definitely our support for your mandate, and certainly our gratitude for coming to speak with us this morning. Thanks again very much.